What's up, dogs? In this JavaScript programming lesson, and many that are going to follow it, you're going to learn real animation programming in JavaScript. Animations for HTML element fading and sliding, as well as HTML5 canvas tag animation programming for the complex stuff. So all of this is to come. And everybody just kind of booted Flash out of the scene, out of the picture, and I hate it. I hate it just as much as you guys do, but I'm not going to sit here and just do Flash tutorials forever when it's a dying technology. And you're, half of you guys are to blame, because half of you guys are you Apple-loving freaks who are like, yeah, death to Flash, Flash sucks. But now you know what? Now you have no replacement tool, and now you got some douchebag like me having to teach you raw animation in JavaScript, because you guys keep using frameworks. None of you want to learn how to do raw animation. It's a simple timed loop. I'm gonna punch you people in the face if you don't understand for real what's going on, man. I'm getting pissed off. Okay, before we get started with the programming, let's take a look at the finished product of what we're going to be learning how to build within this video tutorial. You can see I titled it Fade In and Out Without Frameworks. Remove your training wheels and ride your bike, pilgrims. So if I click Fade Out, you'll see what happens. I made the box fade out and fade in. So you see? And it works nice. It doesn't even get hung up, even if it's in mid-fade. So when you fade out, I programmed it in such a way to where when it fades out, the box will disappear and the space that the box was occupying is removed from the page. So you can program it like that, but I'll also show you a way to alter your script in a very easy way to make those boxes stay there. For instance, if I wanted that space, that height, to stay on the page, but the box to just fade out, you can do that too. But I think it makes more sense when you fade out to remove the box completely. Okay, let's rock and roll. And for those of you guys who are very new to JavaScript, I'm also going to show you how to take your functions and put them into an external JavaScript file and link to it in the head tag. That way you can keep your HTML page nice and neat, and you'll have your external JavaScript powering the page. And you'll have a very lean and lightweight fade in and fade out function set that you can use in all of your projects and all of your pages by simply applying that external JavaScript file. Now, before we apply those three boxes to the page, we're going to put in a style element here into the head of the document. Type text CSS, and then go down a couple of lines and make sure you close off that style tag. And you can see I'm just starting with the bare bones of a validating HTML5 document. Okay, so before we apply those three boxes, actually I'm going to not indent my tags that are in my head element, because in my head element I don't like to indent my tags, but in my body I do indent my tags. Okay, so for the style, what we're going to do is we're going to target any divs in the page that have a class of content box. So if the div says class content box, it's going to be affected by all of the CSS. The CSS is very simple. Gives it a background color of baby blue, a width of 300 pixels, height 100, padding 12. So each one of the boxes that I apply to my page are going to have that class content box, so they'll get that style. Okay, so in the body element, I'm going to change this H2 content to say fade in, fade out without frameworks. Then I'm going to apply a div. I'll go down a couple of lines and I'll open up a div element, give it an ID that's equal to div1. Then we're going to give it that class of content box. So you can just copy that, class equals content box. Then we'll just write in the content area for that div content box and make sure we close that div element. And we're going to want 3 of those. So let's just copy that while we're at it and put 1, 2, 3 and change this to say div2, this to say div3, and the unique IDs are what we're going to use to communicate to these divs with JavaScript. The class that you see, content box, that's simply for the CSS, and the CSS has very little to do with the programming that we're going to be doing in JavaScript. It's really just the style, the way the box looks. But the real guts of this programming lesson is going to be the JavaScript functions that we set up. Now, to make div1 fade in and fade out, we got to put a couple of buttons up there. And really, before I put this button in place, these functions that are firing off called fade in and fade out, they can happen anytime within your JavaScript, and it doesn't have to be initiated by a button. It could be on load event of the page. When the page first loads, you can fade something in. At any time in your JavaScript you can do this, but we're just setting it up using buttons so you guys have a nice example. This we're going to say on click, so we'll target the on click event of this button when the user presses it. I'm going to fire off a function called fade out. open close parentheses, and then put single quote in there. And in between your single quotes, you're going to target this div1. And then for the content section of that button, you can just type in fade out. Make sure you close that button tag. Alright, so you can take that button and duplicate it, and you want to say fade in for this button, and you want to target div1. Change this to say fade in, and you're all set with that. Now you can just grab those two, and you're going to do the same thing for div 2 and 3. So right above div 2, let's just target div 2 with the fade in and fade out functions now. You don't have to change anything else. Then you paste it in another time right here. Oop, this has to say div 2. This has to say div 3, div 3. And that's the way you can do it dynamically for all of your boxes on the page. And we'll set up the function to be really smart, so you can make any boxes at any time, even multiple boxes simultaneously. You can make fade in and fade out using these function sets. Now, just to separate these boxes with some other random HTML content, I'll go under the div1, and I'm going to put in a little paragraph tag that says content that lives under my box. And I'll do that for all of those. Right under each div, I'll put in a little paragraph that says content under my box. And I'll press Control S to save my file. And now all we have to do is go up into the head and put a JavaScript function. So first we'll open up the JavaScript scripting element, script type, text JavaScript, go down a couple of lines and make sure we close off this script element. So we need two functions here. We need function fade in, open close parentheses, open curly brace, and go down a couple of lines and put in the closing curly brace. So there's your function nest all set up and ready to go. Now down in the HTML, we're sending in one parameter each time any of these buttons, or one argument each time any of these buttons are clicked. And the argument is going to be, which is the div that you want to target for fading in or fading out. So you have to relay that to this function in the parentheses here. And we're just going to call it element. So that'll be a variable name that refers to either div1, div2, or div3 on the page, depending on which one is being commanded for fade in or fade out. Now, before those functions actually execute, when the page loads, we want the page to have two variables in JavaScript ready to go. The first one is going to be called var fade in from, and the second one is variable fade out from. And you can see fade in from has a value of 0 and fade out from has a value of 10. And I'm going to be explaining to you the opacity settings in CSS that we're going to be targeting and how the numeric values work for the opacity. Okay, in the fade in function, the first thing we want to do is target the element. So we're going to make a variable called target, which is equal to document.getElementById element. So if it's the div1 or div2 or div3 being commanded to fade in or fade out, that will be loaded into this variable called target, so we can easily refer to it within the rest of our code here. Now you want to make sure every time a box is faded in that you set its style to display equals block. And that will make sure that the element is showing, because it might have been faded out or it might not be showing by default when the page loads, and you want to make sure that you set it to block so it does show. But we're also going to animate it, and it'll have an opacity setting of 0, and it'll go all the way up to its highest. Okay, next we're going to create a variable called new setting. And that's going to be your new opacity setting in your animation. It's going to keep changing as this function runs. So we can access this fade in from variable, which is 0 by default. And we're going to say divided by 10. But keep in mind that this fade in from value is going to change because we're going to increment it each time that the fade in function runs. And this fade in function runs as long as it needs to accomplish the task. And it all happens very, very quickly. We're going to use a timed loop. So really the base, before I program anymore, I want to convey to you that the basics for animating HTML elements really is to take it from one CSS property value to another. So say if your box had a width of 100 and you want to animate its width from 100 to 300, you can animate it growing over those 200 pixels, and the person watching the page would see the box actually growing in real time from 100 to 300 pixels if you use a little timed loop. And that's what I'm going to be showing you how to do. So you don't want to snap from opacity 0 to full opacity right away when the button's pressed. You want to gradually fade it in very quickly, but using a little bit of time duration so it doesn't happen right away, and you go through all the values of the opacity from 0 to 1. So is that making any sense? So instead of going from one value to another abruptly, you want to animate those properties from one value to the next over a timed loop. Now after we get the new setting, because fade in from is going to be constantly changing, so we're constantly going to have a new setting, then we're going to apply that to our target element. So we say target.style.opacity is equal to new setting. And what's really cool about setting your opacity in the JavaScript rather than the CSS is that it works universally the same. This one line will work universally the same in Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and all the big name browsers that you want to test it in. So we don't need any workarounds or any crap like that within this lesson. Now to make fade in from constantly change each time this loop runs, we're going to say fade in from ++. And what that means is basically fade in from is equal to fade in from +1. So if you had a little equation here that said fade in from equal to fade in from +1, it would equal the same thing as saying fade in from ++. It just adds 1 to its current value. And this function fade in is going to be looped on itself. It's going to run over and over and over. We're going to set up our loop timer. So that's a variable called loop timer, and that represents the set timeout method. And the set timeout method gets 2 arguments. The first argument is the function that you want to run at this time interval. And this time interval is the second parameter. So this time interval is actually this would be 50 milliseconds. So every 50 milliseconds, which is much less than a second, you're going to run this fade in function. It's going to loop on itself. And we just make sure, since fade in is requiring one argument being passed to it, which is the target element, you can just feed that right back into itself. Basically, you're doing the same thing as you're doing here, but you're doing it up here. And you're doing it dynamically with the element variable. Okay, so opacity for HTML elements ranges from 0 to 1. So if the element is at opacity setting of 0, it's invisible. Nobody can see it. If it has opacity of 1, that means it's fully visible. And that might not make sense to a lot of people because you're used to 0 to 100 scale maybe. But this is 0 to 1 scale. And you have values such as 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4. If you wanted half opacity, you can make it 0.5. And that would make your element half opaque, or half transparent. Alright, so instead of 0 to 100 for opacity settings in CSS, we use 0 to 1. And some of you might be saying, why are you taking this fade in from value and dividing it by 10 here? And that's because when you apply the setting to the target, this new setting has to be from 0 to 1. It can only be really in that range. So it has to be 0 or 0.1, 0.2, all the way to 1. It can't be higher than a 1. So you have to divide that fade in from variable by 10, and that'll give you a decimal number. And I did that so you could just normally increment things without worrying about the decimals. So you're really using a 0 to 10 scale. If it's 0, that means it's invisible. If it's 10, that means it's fully visible. And we're using those variables to do the incrementing each time the loop runs, but we're making a new setting by dividing that variable by 10 and applying that new setting to the opacity. Alright, so I've explained everything that's going on here in depth. Now let's just take that whole function, fade in, and right under it, let's put fade out. So I'm going to collapse all the code in fade in, that way we don't get confused. Make this one fade out. And everything's going to be pretty much the same, but we're going to target this fade out from variable instead of the fade in from variable. So we got to grab that one. And anywhere where it says fade in from, you want to change that to fade out from. So right here, and right here, and right there. So those three places. And then you simply want to say fade out minus minus. Because instead of going up, we want to be going down in the opacity settings on this one to fade it out. Now this one's going to be a little different with the styling of the block. We're going to take the styling block out there because when you're fading out, your element's already going to be on the page, so you don't have to specify display block in the fade out function at that point. But what you do have to specify is you have to change target style opacity equals 0 here to make sure it's fully invisible when it gets down to the end of its little animation. And then you're going to put that line here, but change this to none. That way the element actually goes away when it reaches 0. When the animation reaches 0 and it fades out, you want the box to go away, you can apply this line of code. If you want the box area that it was occupying on the page to remain, you just comment that line out, and the real estate, the space, will remain where the element was, but it'll still disappear. But if you want the actual space to collapse as well, you just leave that line active. So let's see, fade in from, that needs to be fade out from. Okay, so I said 3 times. It needs to be changed 4 times in here. Fade out from there, fade out from there, fade out from there, and fade out from there. To not say fade in from anymore. Okay? And you can remove that comment because it's in the function above. And I might have to change something else. It's very possible that I need to change something else here. And actually, yep, I see right there, I need to change that to a 0. Because you have to evaluate if fade out from is equal to 0, you know it's at the end of the animation. So that is when you clear timeout and you kill the function. Alright, now let's render this in your favorite browser. So I'm just going to test it in Chrome here and see if I got the results that I wanted. So I click fade out, that should go away. Okay, see, I need to change something else here. Right here it says fade out from equals 0. That should be 10. That should be reset to 10. So I think that was my issue. Let's see. Press F12. Fade out. Nope, there's something else. Derp. This says fade in the loop timer. That should say fade out. Now let's see what we got. And I'm going to leave those mistakes in there just to show you guys we screw up even a little bit. You know, we got to go back and say, oh, my code's not doing this, I got to make it do that. You got to do that a lot when you're programming things. Alright, so fade out and fade in is working fine for that one. Let's see if this one here. You can see our boxes are not collapsing. They're keeping the real estate, so we got to fix that. Sometimes I am a friggin' idiot. Display, not dislay. I had that dislay. That should say display. Now if you run it in your browser, fade out, and it goes away. There you go. That's the functionality you want. And it's very possible that this one up here has dislay as well instead of display. Now, fade out, fade in, fade out, fade in. And you can even do it in mid-fade and it'll snap to the other function. Okay? So that's how it works. It's all done. And you can test it in different browsers. So let's go ahead and do that so people don't give me a hard time. Preview in browser, Internet Explorer, allow block content, fade out, fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out, fade out, fade out. Okay. And let's check it in Firefox real quick. Fade out, fade in, fade out, fade out, fade in, fade in. Everything's good. Sorry about that. I bet you guys, when you saw me say put the word dislay there, you're probably laughing, right? I bet you laughed at me. It's not funny, man. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm gonna laugh at you next time you mess up. But I got my working application. It was just something that threw me off for about 3 seconds. So now let's teach you how to externalize all of this code. So let's take all of the code that's in the JavaScript, only within the JavaScript tag, and press Control X to remove it. And you can take this closing part of the script tag and collapse it up there next to the opening part of the script tag, and then just add source equals and put the name of the JavaScript file that we're going to create right now. So let's name it fade effects. .js. Now press Control S to save this file. Then you're going to create a new document. And depending on which code editor that you use, I use Dreamweaver usually, but depending on which code editor you use, there's a different process to creating files, and you should be very familiar with whatever the process is for your code editor. I'm going to create a JavaScript file. I'm going to remove that default data and put in all of my JavaScript that I cut out of the other file. Then I can press Control S to save this file, and I'm going to save it in the same folder that my web page is in, Fade Effects. Press Save, and there you have your fadeeffects.js file, which is an external file that houses your fade in and fade out functions that you can then just put this one line in, and you can apply it to all of your web pages. So if you have this one web page where you have these three boxes you want to fade in and fade out, you just apply this one line. But say you have a contact page with a form on it, and when they press a button you want something to fade in, you can use this same line, and these functions will be available to you within that page as well. Make sure you link to your fadeeffects.js. Fundamentals are very much the same for any CSS attributes that you want to target. So if we look in Fade Effects right here, we happen to be targeting the opacity, but you could target anything. You can target an element's width, its height. You can target its left, top, right, and bottom properties to make it slide around and move on the page. So you can move it from location 1 to location 2 over a timed loop, and it'll actually animate to that position. So JavaScript animation is very simple, and it's not something we should all be running to frameworks for just simple basic animations. I mean, going to frameworks for something that is ultra complex is sometimes needed. But if it's something as simple as fade in or fade out animations, you can really set that up yourself as an external, slim, lightweight file that'll accomplish those tasks for you. And since you code it yourself, you can tweak all of these numbers. You can actually send in new arguments if you wanted these functions to take in a variable 2, whatever you want to send in. So a lot can be done. This can all be tweaked to perform exactly the way you want it to. And actually it could be set up to perform very dynamically. Alright, so I'll have this code available at developphp.com where all of my tutorials are. And the code will be right under the video where it plays, and I'll put the link to the Develop PHP page in the YouTube video description. Alright, so I guess I'll see you guys in the next lesson.